Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending upon where you are. Today's presentation is going to talk about PCI compliance and why do small businesses and local governments have a difficult time with PCI compliance. If you're a larger enterprise, some of this stuff may apply to your organization, but if you're a smaller entity, like a local government or a small to medium business, more of this is going to affect the way you process, or the struggles that you would have in PCI compliance. And I did throw a little bit of a Star Wars theme on this presentation today, just to make it a little bit more interesting. We're joined today by Robert DeRook from Indiana University. He may be joining us a little bit later. He's not online just yet. But I always like to start off with everything with, like, why do you care? Who cares? Does PCI compliance really even matter? And when you look at a small merchant, they will oftentimes avoid PCI compliance because of the cost or the perceived cost and technical requirements for PCI compliance. And especially something for like a local government who may transact credit cards in multiple different methods, it becomes much more difficult than traditional grocery chain store. Grocery chain store, if you think about it, they have a bunch of checkout stands, and yes, they have a lot of point of interaction devices, a lot of terminals, but they take credit cards one way. And if they have an online presence, then they take credit cards two different ways. If you're a local government, you may take credit cards, I've seen as many as 17 different ways. And if you think about it, for a city, they might have a different system for permits, a different system for citations, a different system for parking meters or parking garages, a different system for the pool or the community center or the classes that they have. And you can see how the library, some cities have golf courses. So you can see that in their instances, they have a lot of different ways that they're processing credit cards, and you have to evaluate all the different ways to determine whether or not you're going to be PCI compliant. That's what's difficult for them. But why do you care? Well, you care because something bad can happen. And it is this carrot and the stick, right? But this is more the stick side of things. If there is a data breach, the city or the local government or the small business is going to be liable for it. I think the most recent study that I've seen is most small businesses that suffer a PCI or credit card breach do not recover from the breach. Large organizations like Target may weather the storm with it, and they obviously did, and their stock price is back up, but they still spent a lot of money in fines and fees and investigations and all that. So even though their stock price is up, that's a lot of money that they didn't have to spend. They'd be a much more profitable company had it never happened. So that's why we care, because there's a cost. But there's different other aspects to it. And why is PCI compliance really important? And to get to the Star Wars side of things, because I want to do this, when we were at the RSA conference, I saw this sticker, and they stole my idea, because this is what I was going to go with. I was thinking, I know it's a good one, isn't it?
It's great.
So when you look at it, think of your organization as the Death Star, right? And you can have all the best bells and whistles on there, but it was one little thermal port that took out the whole entire thing. And when you look at something like the Target breach, what was left open was a connection for a vendor to get in to look at and manage the maintenance of the cooling systems for their stores. That was it. The people were able to get in through that connection and then move laterally within the organization to get to the credit card information. So in theory, what happened to Target is basically what happened to the Death Star. Very little tiny breach was left open. And what's more interesting about this is Target, a couple months prior to that, had passed their PCI assessment. Their qualified security assessors came out, did their assessment, Target passed, and yet a couple months later, this one little thing was open, and it caused the breach that cost lots of money. So So, and this probably is making you, if you're a small business or local government, scared. It makes it worse. I'm sorry. But how do we find those small thermal ports, and what can we do to reduce risk? And that's what I hope that you will get out of this thing. So, getting back to who cares and why do you care, if you have an incident, there's going to be an evaluation to determine whether or not you were compliant at the time of that incident. And that will require forensic audit to come in and evaluate. Forensic investigators are going to come in and take a look at your organization and determine whether or not you're at fault or they're at fault. And they're going to put you in what they call safe harbor or not in safe harbor. Safe harbor is if you're doing PCI and you have PCI DSS and you've implemented it within your organization and you have a breach, they're going to say, hey, you're following our rules that we say should make you safe, and since you are, we're going to take all the costs. So cardholders and banks lost money, the card brands and banks are going to eat it up. You're not going to have to pay the losses. Great. But if you're not compliant, then you're not going to be put in safe harbor, and the merchant, which would be the local government or small business, is going to be fully liable for all losses. Cardholder losses, bank losses, including fines, and on top of that, cardholder losses. So, card brand and cardholder, sorry. I may have misused the term twice. Anyways, that is where you're going to come, and that's where the cost really comes in. I had a client that's a local university, and one of their payment systems was non-compliant, and they were being charged $10,000 a month in fines until it was rectified. And the way they collect the fines is you process $10,000 a month in credit card transactions. They keep it, and then they pass on to you what's left over. So I always like to say this, and it's kind of funny. It's the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules, and that's Visa, MasterCard, Discover Card, JCB, and American Express. They're the ones that hold the purse strings. They're the ones that get to do it. And so you want to try to avoid being not compliant if at all possible. Now, so if you're outside of safe harbor, what are your total losses? What are the things that you're going to look at that could be detrimental to you? Obviously, the losses of the cardholders, everybody's card who got stolen or used for illicit purposes, the losses of the banks, the losses of the card brands, plus any fines that they may have, plus the cost of the forensic audit. And then in addition to that, here's the kicker to that, if you were a level 4 merchant, they're now going to pop you all the way up to level 1, and you're going to have to pay for an audit every year. So that increased attestation requirement, that's basically saying a QSA now has to come in and audit you, even if you did not require it before. Small businesses probably cannot afford that. QSA audits are very expensive. So it's not something that you want to do. And then all of that aside, there's going to be some loss of consumer trust. Now, you may say, look, I still go into Target. I still use my credit card. They didn't lose my trust. I still go in there. And to some extent, that's true because it's kind of like Target and it's a big company. And I don't mean to pick on them because there's plenty of other businesses out there that are good examples. But a lot of small businesses, people will have tended to stray away from continuing to patronize some of those organizations. So for large organizations, it seems like people have more trust because they're large, and with smaller ones, they don't, because most of the smaller ones seem to go out of business within about 6 months after the event. And I think there was, I don't know, Visa had some statistics on that. I saw in some presentation somewhere. So, but if you're a local government, it's a completely different thing, right? Because let's say you're a city, you have a city council, and you have a citizen that's now upset, and they're now going to go to city council. They're going to make a big issue of it, right? So it's completely different because there's more of a political bent to a local government, school district or city or district. There's going to be probably a little bit more of a loss of consumer trust, and it's not that they're not going to continue to use the services of the local government because they probably don't have a choice, but they're definitely going to make a big stink about it. And then that's where you end up with a lot more political backlash, so to speak. I guess that's the right way to put it. rather than actual dollars and cents losses or consumers going somewhere else for services. So the one thing that I can say as an auditor and looking at PCI compliance for a number of different organizations is that most people kind of think of it as a one-time event, and it's not a one-time event. You know, I oftentimes get somebody says, well, you know, last year we said yes to the questionnaires, the SAQ questionnaires, so we're all good, right? No, it requires that there's ongoing practices and processes within the organization that have to be continuously going. And so this is the biggest thing that I find, especially with small businesses and local governments, is that they think that they're compliant when they're not, because they're not continuing to do the processes that they need to be doing. So this is the thing that you want to kind of look at and make sure that you bake it in from the very beginning, that PCI compliance and the requirements that you have, there's a list of the 200 plus controls that you have to follow, making sure that those controls are in place and they're effective and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. If you don't, then you're going to run the risk that one of those controls has failed or is no longer in place or is no longer being done, and then it opens your organization up to some level of liability or potential breach, which we want to do. So like Ryota, he said, control, you must learn control, right? And as an auditor, I'm always talking about controls, and this is what we have to do. We have to make sure we put those controls in and that we do assessments from time to time to verify that we are doing what we need to do. Even if you're not required to have an outside assessment, you can do an internal assessment on an annual basis at least to verify compliance with PCI. And I'm not saying, and I'm not a big fan of people just doing a checkbox approach, right? You know, I answered the questionnaire, it's all good. I don't think that that's very productive. You actually have to look at the controls and verify that they're in place, they're operating as intended, and they produce the desired outcome, right? You want to make sure that they work. I mean, that's the long and short of it. And it's not simply just saying yes or no and moving on. Now, I do have to say that there is something to be said for compliance, but as an auditor, I have to go in and I have to be black and white. Are you compliant or are you not compliant? Are you doing X, Y, Z? And if you're not doing X, Y, Z, then you're not compliant, period. Now, the issue with that as a business point of view is, yeah, but is my risk low enough that I can continue to operate and not get any of those fines that you were talking about, right? So let's say, so it's more of a pragmatic approach, and for a lot of small businesses, you may have to take the pragmatic approach at this point in time. And that is, instead of struggling with, am I compliant or not compliant, and get to the point of saying, oh, hey, have I reduced risk to an acceptable level? So in other words, what we're saying is a best effort at PCI compliance. Do what you can to reduce the risk to the lowest possible way. And there's ways to do it. We'll talk about that. So I have some takeaways for you and some stuff for you to do when you go back to your organization. But things that you can do to make a difference. And so if I put on the other hat and say, let's do it from a risk management point of view, I'm saying, okay, there's a risk that we could have a breach. So how do we minimize that risk apart from being compliant? Just what can I do to really do it? So limit the number of transactions, different types of transactions we take. Segment the network as much as possible, even though we can't put all the controls in place. Hit the big ones, the big controls that will reduce the risk the most. And looking at it from that point of view may make it more manageable. Now, as an auditor, I can't tell you to do that. I got to tell you, you got to follow the rules. You got to do 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you got to do all those things. From a risk management standpoint, you say, well, 1, 2, and 4 are really important. 3 is really expensive to do. But if I do 1, 2, and 4, and maybe this other compensating control, then 3 is not so bad, right? So that's the way you kind of look at it from that point of view. Now, it's interesting. Rob and I were at the RSA conference, and one of the sessions we went to was on PCI standards, and there's changes coming, and there's going to be a draft published for comments coming out this year, and there were some interesting comments, and I don't know how to take what they said, because they were being very cagey about it. They didn't want to spill too much information. But one of the things it sounds like is they understand that it's difficult for small businesses to become PCI compliant, and they basically understand that most small businesses are not compliant. They admitted that, and they're trying to push them to go towards what's called P2PE, which is point-to-point encryption. We'll talk about that towards the end of this session. But what I thought was really interesting is they're talking about actually all the changes that have come with PCI DSS recently have been small changes and incremental changes to the standard. Now there seems to be some real change coming that's going to be a little bit larger. And I got the impression, I don't know, Rob, you can tell me if you got the same impression, is that they may back off on some of the requirements. Understanding that
it just sounded like they were going to kind of like step it back a little, because some of the other underlying protocols are being changed or being completely phased out. So like one of them that I went through and looked at was, we were just talking about point-to-point encryption being tunneled over something other than like SSL or TLS 1.0, because those inherent protocols have been out for a while, but the protocols themselves are being retired and being replaced with, as a default, the upgraded or the more recent implementations of them.
Cool. I kind of got the impression too that they may be not going into this. They may be going into allowing maybe risk accepting something. I don't know, or allowing you to come up with other compensating controls. I don't know. It's still in the works. They didn't say anything definitive. Like I said, they were being cagey about it. So it's something to watch. Anyways, they did promise it was going to be a big change. So who knows what that means. So again, like I said, risk management, focus on the likelihood and the impact, implement whatever controls you can, and then whatever's left over you have acceptable risk. Where compliance is more of a yes, no, and these are prescribed controls, you got to do them all. So there's two different ways of looking at it, and there's benefits and drawbacks to either of those. Most businesses will probably do everything else on the risk management side of things and not so much on the compliance side of things. But the reason why we have compliance is because most organizations, unless they're told they have to, and there's a big stick to ensure that they follow and have prescriptive controls, they won't do it. So, businesses want to make money, so if they can make money without trying to implement, because security is oftentimes seen as an overhead or a cost, and it typically is. But proper risk management would say we want to make sure that we avoid adverse effects to the business. Another problem that I see with organizations, this is a big one that I always have, and every time I go to an organization to look at PCI, this is one of the things that comes up, and that is, oh, well, I got PCI compliant hardware, or I got a PCI compliant application, so we're all good, right? We're PCI compliant. So the problem with that approach is that it's not just the application that is the important thing or the hardware that's the important thing. PCI compliance requires that you have PCI compliant hardware. You have PCI compliant applications, that you're using PCI compliant service providers, and that your people's processes and technology are all also PCI compliant. So I can buy a PCI compliant application and hardware and put it onto a regular network with no controls whatsoever, and I'm not PCI compliant. So just by definition of buying a PCI compliant device or application does not make the organization PCI compliant. Your processes have to be PCI compliant. Your network and the technology you use that application and hardware exist on have to be PCI compliant, and your people have to follow through with all of that. So PCI compliance is not just checking a box and saying, yes, I got a PCI compliant application. It's more than that. And also, the same thing with hardware. So organizations, if you think that, and I have this all the time, is especially in like a local government situation, city finance people, they say, yeah, we're PCI compliant because, Parks and Rec just bought this new software and they said it's PCI compliant. The problem is they bought the application. They knew they were supposed to ask about PCI compliance, and they did the right thing. They asked. They said, hey, is that application PCI compliant? And they said, yes, it is. The caveat, what's the caveat? Well, you have to have the people, process, and technology around it within the organization also has to be compliant. And you have to implement that software in a particular way for it to be PCI compliant. So most vendors or service providers or hardware manufacturers will give you a list of how to deploy it in a PCI compliant manner, because you could deploy it in a manner that is not PCI compliant. So that's the important part, is making sure it's not just one component. Everything has to be PCI compliant for your organization to be PCI compliant. So just remember that. Now, next thing that I always have an issue with, especially with small businesses, I got to tell you the story. I went up to a buddy of mine's house, and he was having a crab feed or something, and so I was going up there to see it. And he lives in a little town in Central Valley, California. And we go there, and before we go to the meeting, we decide we're going to stop and get some coffee at a coffee shop. I go there to get some coffee, and I'm about to use my credit card, and then I stop. And I said, well, let me see if I have any cash. I saw their little wireless router plugged into their cash register, and their terminal plugs into that same router, and that was their wireless router, that they had the Wi-Fi code printed right on the counter for anyone who wanted to log into the secure wireless. And I'm like, oh goodness, this is not good. So the thing that organizations have to know is they have to know what their cardholder data environment is. So what, and everybody's like, what does that mean? Well, what is in scope for compliance? And so there's certain things that you can do to limit what the scope is, but as an organization, you need to have clearly defined what your cardholder data environment is. Why do you need to have that? Because once you know that, any changes to that need to be readdressed. If you add something to that environment, is it PCI compliant? If you take something out, does that leave a hole? You have to know your, I don't know, the SANS top 20 security requirements or missing controls that they always find missing is inventory. And this is kind of like an inventory type of thing. What is all your hardware? What is all your software? And what is all your network? How does it all communicate together? That's your cardholder data environment. Knowing that is most important. And sometimes people forget, and I use this kind of like as a graphic to kind of show you layers. Over here on the right-hand side is like a workstation and the application that you're using, and on the left side is the server that you have, and the data is in an application that's stored in a database that's running on an operating system. It might be in a virtual environment, and then it's on some hardware, and there's a network between those things for everything to communicate with one to another. So understanding that you have this whole stack, your computer, the software that's in it, the network that it's on, that it has to go through. This is all a part of your cardholder data environment, and you need to understand this in order to understand what the risk is of a particular control not being in place. So this is kind of one of those important things. I find most organizations are not aware or keep good tabs on their cardholder data environment. And getting back to the last one, where you may have a department that says, hey, I'm going to purchase this one particular software because it's PCI compliant, not realizing that it now put it into the network, and now that whole network is a part of the cardholder data environment. I had another instance where, well, I'll say that story for a second. We'll get to that story in just a second. Don't want to get ahead of myself. So you also sort of need to know your data flow. So how does the data, your card information, get from your reader all the way to the bank, right? And that's part of your cardholder data environment as well, like we're talking about. How does it go through this whole entire process? And you should figure out where that data flow is. Now, I made this very simple diagram, and you know, it's very simple, it looks straightforward. Card gets read by the cash register, goes to the server, and the server goes to the bank. Well, we know that there's a network between all of that, right? So the problem that we have with this is the devil's in the details, right? So you have much to learn. It's never that simple. right? So I could do a data flow diagram like that, but it's never going to be that simple. And this is overly simple too, mostly because I didn't have all day to make a network diagram. But so when you take a look at this, you have to think of all the different ways that you may be accepting credit cards in your environment. And this is typical of, let's say, a local government, like a city, because you might have things like parking meters and mobile payments and virtual terminals, and you may have a website that takes payments, and then you may have cash registers at different departments. People may be sending you fax credit card information on paper. So you have all these different ways that credit card information is going into your network, and now your cardholder data environment includes all of this other stuff. If you accept payments via fax, your fax machine is now a part of your cardholder data environment. And most organizations got rid of faxes, and faxes now come in and come out on the copiers. That means that that copier is now a part of your PCI data environment. And guess what? Most of those copies, what do? They have a hard drive inside of them, and what do they store? Everything that gets printed or faxed on that machine gets stored on that hard drive. So guess what you're doing now? You're storing cardholder data on a copier, which, by the way, probably isn't updated like it should be. Most of them are not. And if you have a fax, if you still have one of those fax machines and it has a hard drive in it, I guarantee you're probably not updating it. And that gets to the next question is, okay, where are you storing all this information? And it's really interesting because when we do like assessments, and then we have scanning tools that can go in and look for credit card numbers, but you don't even have to do that. You just have to look at all the different ways that you accept payments and understand the network, and you can find all kinds of different ways that people are storing data, and you don't necessarily always know it. Now, you make backups of stuff, right? So let's say you have a database, and here's the story that I have. I had a local government that had a utility billing software, and they wanted to accept payments online. And they wanted us to do an assessment before they went live, and which is a good thing to do. And it actually saved them some stuff when we did it. And what we ended up doing is we came in and we said, hey, where's the original documentation that you asked for these people to implement? Because we're going to look at what you asked them to implement, and we're going to see what it is. So they give us the things, and the city had said they do not want to store credit card information. Great. So the city asked for the right thing. Problem is, we go in to do the assessment, and we find out that they are storing credit card information within the database. And so we're like, okay, so we tell the city, this is what we found. We found that you're storing credit card information, and you had on your thing said not to, and we recommend that you don't, unless you have a really, really good business reason for doing it. And then they went back to the vendor, and the vendor said, well, you said that you wanted to be able to process chargebacks. In order to do that, we need to keep the card information. So, but the thing was, the city staff didn't know what that question entailed, and the vendor did not tell the staff that said, yes, we want to be able to do chargebacks, what that really meant, and that it would change one of the requirements. Somewhere in there, that communication was lost. There should have been like a change order. Said the original agreement said that you didn't want it, you've asked for this, and now we've changed it to being stored. But you want to know those things, because now it's being stored there. And then if it's being stored there, guess what? You're probably doing backups. Where are those backups? Now, if it's stored, it should be encrypted, right? But that's a requirement. Not always is the database stuff encrypted. We find a lot of times that it's supposed to be encrypted and it's not. Or the encryption's not working, or it decrypts for this purpose or this upgrade or whatever it was, and now it's still decrypted. So you want to make sure that it is decrypted. And if it is encrypted, then when you do your backups, in theory, it is still encrypted. It should be. What about people accepting payments via voicemail? And what about your voicemail system? Where is that? Or do you have online automated payments where someone calls in and talks to a robot, you say your credit card information, makes your payment for you? Local governments may run into this because they have utility billing sometimes, and people want to pay their utility billing, so they want to do calls. I found that most local governments that do this outsource it to somebody else, which is good, because then they have to deal with the PCI compliance. and the city would only have to make sure that they are compliant. Small businesses probably don't have that type of stuff, but they may have online payments, but if they are a small business, they probably have that outsourced as well. Other types of things you might find is people call in to make a payment and they take it over the phone, and guess what? The person taking the phone call writes it down on a piece of paper. Or maybe they even have a form that they fill out and they write it down and they leave it, on their desk, or they put it in a drawer. Well, now you're storing credit card information again, right? So we want to make sure that we're not storing it, and we want to make sure we know everywhere it is. Even if it's paper, not just electronic, we want to know where the paper ones are as well. Granted, the paper ones have a less risk because, one, somebody has to physically break into your location, and then they have to take all those documents, whatever they are. And typically, there's probably not going to be a lot of documents, although I don't know. I went to one city, and they had documents back, I think it was for 10 years, for all credit card receipts for 10 years when they were printing the whole credit card number on the forms. And that's not practice anymore. Now, usually the receipts have the last four. Merchants can still have the whole number on the receipt that they retain, but now you're storing credit card information, so you don't want it. Most of them have now switched to the customer gets the last four digits, and the printout that is for the merchant also only has the last four digits, and that's a better thing to do. Like I said, you may be storing credit card information in a fax machine because you don't know that you are because of a fax if you get a lot of payments that way. I have found that most organizations, local governments and businesses, don't do a lot of business via fax anymore, but worth noting that it's a one way that you can do it. One other one that's really interesting is internally within your network, you are technically not required to have your traffic encrypted, although it's best practice to have it encrypted. And it is required to be encrypted on any untrusted network. So going across the internet needs to be encrypted. Most organizations are saying, hey, encrypt it internally, even between your workstations and your back-end servers, and I think that that's the best process, obviously. However, if it's not encrypted, do you have any type of network monitoring software that is capturing packets? And if you do, is it now storing that credit card information? So there's these other places that you kind of have to look for, and there's others, but just kind of like following the trail of what's the different ways that people are organizations are accepting payments, figuring out if there's any other storage. I mean, here's a good thing. Do you print out credit card numbers ever? Well, now it's in a printer spool on your workstation or on the print server, right? So now you have, so anytime it's in plain text where you can see it and it's being printed, if you do that, I had an organization that printed out a report every day of all the transactions that they had, and it gave the user, who the user was, what they signed up for, it was for signing up for classes, the credit card number they had, the amount that they purchased it for. It gave all this information. They printed that out every day, and then they would put that into a hard file in a file cabinet. Well, now you're storing PCI stuff in a file cabinet, right? So now there's requirements, and obviously you can't encrypt it, but you're now storing it in that file cabinet now as a part of your cardholder data environment. So making sure that you have those areas secured as well is going to be a part of that. So what should you do with this? Well, limit this as much as possible. I always recommend that if you don't need to take, because it's not very popular to take fax payments anymore, if you can avoid that, just avoid it. Don't accept them fax. I have organizations that clearly say on their website, do not email credit card information, we will not process it. Because now if they send you their credit card information, now you're storing credit card information in your mail server. And your mail server is not designed to store cardholder data. The requirements for encryption are difficult for mail servers to implement, although not impossible, but expensive nonetheless. So trying to limit those different ways that you have it. So there's a couple different ways that you can do it, and we could talk about some of those. Making sure that you ask for no emails for cardholder data. Don't take fax if you don't need to take fax. Don't physically store it if you don't need to. I have a lot of local governments that store that information, and I ask why. What do you need it for? Do you have a business reason for storing it? Because that's the other thing about PCI. If you don't have a business reason for storing it, you shouldn't store it. So the cardholder data you have, which is primary account number, which is the biggest thing that we're concerned about, is make sure if you don't need it, don't store it. And what about the CVV2 or the security code? Well, you're never supposed to store authentication information. Yet, how many forms have you filled out to send your kids to school to pay for a field trip or something for it, ask for all this information for your credit card on a form that you're supposed to fill out, a paper form, and then ask you for the CVV2 or the security code for it? That's not supposed to be put on paper. Visa guidelines say don't do it. And yet, merchants keep on doing it. So if you can avoid doing that, avoid doing it, because the security code is an authentication mechanism, and if you store that, then anyone that gets that piece of paper or that thing that you have it stored in, they can now authenticate themselves. And it's going to assume that they have the credit card because they have that code with it. You can do things like isolate your network, consolidate the ways that you accept credit cards. Local governments have a harder time with this because Parks and Rec is different than the police department because they have their own software. One does citations and one does classes and stuff like that. And they don't work together. And because they don't work together, you have to use different merchants, not merchant banks in order to process it sometimes. Sometimes you have the same merchant bank, but you have a different processor in between or a different application, and you can't really do all of it through one, which is unfortunate. If you have the ability to consolidate, that makes your footprint smaller and makes it a little bit easier and more manageable to become PCI compliant. And then the other one that we'll talk about here in a minute is the P2PE, which is point-to-point encryption. And going back to what we talked about at RSA, that was one of the things that they appointed small businesses to. They said they want to get more of them to it. And they had an interesting fact. They said 80% of the readers that are out there today, the card readers, the point of interaction devices, are capable of P2PE. So maybe an upgrade can get them, a software upgrade or firmware upgrade can get them to be P2PE compliant. So worth looking into. The other option is you can always outsource and make it somebody else's problem. It's still your problem, by the way. If they're not compliant, they're accepting payments for you, and then they have a breach, then you're the one that's not going to get paid. You're the one that's going to be responsible for it. Your responsibility as a merchant is to make sure that your service providers are compliant. And verify on I generally say verify on an annual basis that they are, that they have whatever their QSA audit, their report on that, their report on compliance. To ask to see that or the cover letter to that. They may not want to give you the whole report, but that's fine. I just want to verify that you are still compliant and that your independent assessors have made that determination. And you can just check up on that one. And you're still going to have processes internally that you have to do. Like if you had a virtual terminal or something like that, you're still going to have cashiers, and cashiers are still going to be interacting with it. So there's less PCI stuff you do, but there's still some. And you're still going to have on top of that, aside from PCI, Visa merchant guidelines or MasterCard merchant guidelines on preventing fraud and what cashiers should do with the cards when they have them. The other thing, and getting back to the P2PE, basically what it does is from the card reader to the bank or the processor, whoever is doing the processing, and maybe an application in between, the application may get the information but not the card information. It just gets the transaction number and all that other information. It depends upon the solution because there's a couple different solutions for this. And basically the card information and the authentication information is encrypted at the reader all the way to the processor. So nobody in between your network is considered untrusted, all the way from the time that that card touches a device or hovers over the device, depending upon what type it is. This one means that the big pain of trying to make sure that your network and all those solutions are PCI compliant kind of goes away. Makes it a lot easier to do it. This is a solution that you can look at. I have a link here, PCIstandards.org. They have point-to-point encryption solutions, and they talk about the different solutions. Now, In order for you to be PCI compliant, you have to use a compliance solution. So that solution is from your card reader to whoever that third-party provider is that has the application for you, your application provider. That whole solution has to be compliant. I had an organization where they were sold from the vendor, hey, we have P2PE card readers. Great, they did. That's a really good thing. The problem that they ran into is they had the compliant readers, but the solution was not compliant with PCI's DSS. So yes, because what happened is that the solution provider, for whatever reason, and I don't know why they failed, they did not go through the process of being approved by PCI, Security Council. So they have a solution. It does limit cardholder data, but we don't know that it has been tested to verify that it won't actually disclose any information. Now, from the risk side of things, remember I was talking about compliance versus risk last time. From a compliance standpoint, the solution is not compliant because it has to be compliant and has to be listed on the PCI Security Standards website as an approved solution. That being said, if that solution, because to be approved, all you have to do is have your solution, and then you have to go pay to have it tested. And once tested, you then, and once you prove and you pay your money to the PCI security standards, they would put you on the website. What if you have a solution, but you never got it tested, and it does work? Now, as a merchant, I have to look at the vendor and say, okay, it's not an approved solution, so what might have been one of the reasons why they didn't get approved? Maybe they didn't want to spend the money on it. I don't know. There could be all kinds of, did they fail because of something stupid and small? You don't really know. So can you really trust that solution? From a compliance standpoint, I have to say no. Your network is still in scope as an auditor. If I look at that, your network is still going to be a part of your cardholder data environment unless it's an approved solution. If you have an approved solution, then I don't have to look at your network at all. It's not a part of the cardholder data environment. Now, from a risk point of view, you may say, well, I accept the risk. And if you're the business owner or the appropriate person to accept the risk, then maybe that is an acceptable risk for doing business. So thinking about that is kind of important. Now, this is the solution that most small businesses should be looking for and asking for. Tell them that you want to have a P2PE solution. Most of them, you have to lease the devices these days because they want to switch them out quickly. So you can get new devices and get the newest, best device, and then you don't have to worry about all this stuff. So small businesses, that's the way you want to go. Local governments, you probably want to go this way too, although you may have other different ways. Obviously, online payments, this is not a part of it because we're talking about hardware card present transactions for this. So if you have these other types of online or over-the-phone transactions, your solution, your PCI environment and cardholder data environment are going to be different. They're going to include other things. But if you just take it one way, just card present, and you have P2PE, that's the easiest thing that you can do. That's the best way to limit your scope as much as possible. Now, particular to local governments and not so much small businesses, because like I said earlier, small businesses usually take credit cards one way, and that's it. Maybe they do two ways, but usually the other way is probably outsourced. That's their medium-sized business, and then maybe they have it. Like even a large grocery store, like I said, they take it one way, usually at the cash register. It's the one way that they take it. Granted, they may have hundreds and thousands of terminals, but they take credit cards one way. But many of them may also have an online presence. I know that if you go to my local grocery store, you can order online. You pay online and then pick your groceries up, or they can even be delivered. So a lot of organizations are doing that. And usually they may have that in-house if it's a large grocery chain. If it's a small business, probably that was outsourced to another third party. Issue that I find with local governments is, does the left hand know what the right hand's doing, right? And that is, you have, in local governments, sometimes, let's take a city, because usually they have more components than like a school district would, or a district. They have a Parks and Rec, they have a PD, they have business license, they have a library, they have maybe a municipal golf course. They have a bunch of different ways that they take credit cards, or departments to do it. And what a department will oftentimes do, like I said earlier, is they'll just say, hey, I bought the solution, I asked if it was PCI compliant, it is, I'm going to implement it, right? Well, so how do we make sure that everybody's on the right page? We need to come up with a process so that somebody, because when any of those other components of the organization changes their software or their hardware, that's a change to the cardholder data environment. How does that change the PCI requirements for the city as a whole? And this is the thing that this part never gets done. And somebody like a city manager really needs to sometimes say, you can't go with that solution because now the network for the whole entire city now has to have all these compliance controls put in place. So what we recommend is that for all proposed changes, no matter who the department is, and by the way, this PCI change management process I have here, this is just proper IT governance. So if you go into IT governance, the idea is the end unit, the business unit that has the business requirements would go to IT to say, hey, we need an assessment, we need this type of application to do these XY things, this is the business process we needed to support. And IT can come back and say, okay, there's all these solutions and all of these will work with it, these ones won't. And then the business unit goes back and says, okay, we accept this one at this level of risk, implement that. So this is what all I'm proposing for. This is not in PCI DSS, but this is what I propose for especially local governments, because they kind of have their own little niche here, and that is they're taking credit cards in so many different ways, and different departments are in charge of it. And as all those proposed changes, that they go to somebody who can do an assessment. You can outsource that assessment. I do it for a couple of different local governments, but you can get someone who knows something about PCI to come in and do an assessment. You know, they kind of look at it, because I've had a number of organizations where they bought a brand new system. They got chip readers, but they didn't get the P2PE solution. They could have got the P2PE solution, but they didn't. They didn't know any better. They just asked, is it PCI compliant? Well, yes, there's PCI compliance, but then there's better PCI compliance. Had they asked for the P2PE solution, then the network would be out of scope. As it stands now, the entire network's in scope. So now the city has to now segment the network. They have to limit the workstations down to being able to do nothing other than process transactions. So this is all the stuff they end up having to do because a choice was made, not informed choice. And if you think about it, somebody in Parks and Rec or engineering or PD or citations or business development, they're not going to know. They're not PCI experts, and they're not required to be PCI experts, but they need to make sure that someone's addressed the risk, right? And that's proper IT governance. Make sure that, one, the solution does what it's supposed to do and bring value to the organization. The other part of the governance aspect is to make sure that that solution, we've addressed the risks related to it and kept that at a minimum level. So once you do that, have someone do the assessment to determine how does it change the cardholder data environment, how does it impact the overall compliance of the organization, and then write that down somewhere. It should be documented. I'm an auditor because I'd want to see it, right? And then someone needs to make the decision. Now, the decision should not be made, and I hate to say this, IT doesn't make the decision. The decision is made by the end user department, or if there is significant risk, then somebody at an executive level needs to make the decision whether or not that's an acceptable level of risk. IT's job is not to accept risk for the business unit or the business process, but their job is to make sure that they're informed about it. And when I say IT, it depends upon how large your organization is. IT may be split into two different parts. It might be IT and cybersecurity being separate from one another, which would be proper separation of duties. But most small organizations only have IT. They don't have IT and security. So if they do have security, it's physical security people and usually not IT security. If you have the two, great, security should be doing it, or cybersecurity should be doing it, or information security, whatever you want to call it. But most organizations just have the IT. So IT should have input into it to make sure that people are doing the right thing. Here's a good example one. Working at a school district. Math department decides, oh, we're going to buy these new computers because they've got this great software that helps students learn math. and we're going to buy the software, and we're going to buy some computers. So they go out, and this is back in the day. They bought a bunch of iMacs, you know, those big, colorful iMacs that look like, I don't know, like Mork from Mork brought them. Anyways, they got all these, got a whole lab for them, like 30 computers, and they were expensive at the time. Bought those, and then they bought thousands of dollars worth of software to put on it. And they call up IT and say, hey, IT, when are you going to set up these computers? And IT's like, what? We don't even know anything about it. First of all, that department, the math department, got a grant. So the grant is like you put in, say, I want money for this, and then you go in and you spend the money, and they give you the money, and you purchase whatever it is, and they usually want you to write up something and verify that you've done it. And that's about it. No, nobody ever talked to IT about it, like, hey, what do we need to do to get this on the network? What does this, is this software compatible with what we bought? And guess what? It wasn't. So the software they bought only works on Windows devices. So they ended up buying iMacs, and the iMacs don't work, the software doesn't work with it. So then they ended up having to buy another thing. The school ended up having to pay for it because the grant money was already spent. So the school had to go and buy emulators to emulate Windows on top of the iMac, when you could have saved a lot of money just buying Windows devices in the first place. But because IT was not a part of the decision-making process, never was even consulted, they could have told them that up front. Told them either this software and this hardware don't work together. You know, you can go this way or that way. You can get a different application, or you can get different computers. Or this is the money for your grant, you're going to need to cut back on the computers because you have to install emulators now. They could have done all these virtual machines, I guess. That's what we call them today. But they weren't called that then. So there's all these different ways they could have done it. And but proper IT governance is what we want. We want to make sure that they're a part of the process. And anything PCI related, we want to have that same level of governance in there. We want to make sure that the risks are addressed, and we want to make sure that the organization knows what its position is going forward. So I know I spent a lot of time on it, but that's kind of a really important one, especially for those. So road to PCI compliance, I like what Yoda says, try not, do, or do not. There is no such thing as try. So either do it or don't do it, right? But here's the thing. Remember I said it's a continuous process. You want to keep on going, but you need to get started in the first place. So where do you go? And that's really going to be a topic for a future thing, because here's a pathway you can go through to get to PCI compliance, and I can't go through the whole entire process in this session, but in a future session we'll go through it, so it's more of a teaser to let you know. First thing you're going to have to do, and just give you a high-level overview, you need to document what your cardholder data environment is. The second thing that you need to do is then review that cardholder data environment, see what is in it, are the controls in place, and then you need to document it, and you need to keep it documented, and then come up with a remediation list for anything that's not PCI DSS compliant, and then you need to report that back on a regular basis. And this would become a cycle that you would do. And with that other process that I just told you about, that change process, that can help you turn this compliance process into an ongoing, something like the system development lifecycle, where you just continuously go through the process. And that's what you really want to do to get to compliance and to keep compliance. Now, you may say, hey, I'm going to go through all of this, and then I'm still not going to be compliant. Well, great, but you're moving towards it, and that's the big thing. A lot of people get wrapped around the axle trying to do a risk assessment, and I think there was a couple good sessions at RSA this last year talking about risk assessments, and one of them, a guy says, people are really good at risk assessments, they just don't know it. And I think some of that's true. I think what makes it difficult for us is we try to enumerate every possible risk instead of starting with what you got and then building on that forward. So don't try to eat the whole pie at once. Eat one slice and then work your way forward. So start with something. Well, what risks are we addressing? Document it somewhere and you go through the process. That's what I think would make things a lot easier for people if they were trying to do risk assessment. So, but that'll be a future session because I don't think that we can get through it in less than 5 minutes. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, of course, Yoda said it perfectly. Mind what you've learned. Save you it can. See what you can do to limit your cardholder data environment. See what you can do to make sure that you're getting into a process of evaluating what that cardholder data environment is and keeping it up to date, and then making sure that you're continuously working towards compliance even if you're not in compliance. And if you can limit it to the maximum extent that you can. And even if you're not compliant, it's going to reduce your risk. And if it reduces your risk, then it's going to, in theory, save you money in the future, especially if you ever have anything. By the way, I should have mentioned, if you have any questions, go ahead and you can put in questions and we'll answer those for you. Rob, do you have any takeaways from all this?
I started looking at some of the PCI documentation last week to get a kind of a more in-depth view of it. And what I came up with is there are like 12 specific requirements. Out of the 12 requirements, they break down into the 200 and something, required checks and controls that you have to put in place. Some of the things that I looked at were things like, there's a requirement for firewalls, right? And the whole purpose of your firewall is, or firewalls, is to separate and isolate these networks. Well, then it further breaks down and says things like wherever your credit card data exists, that has to be in an isolated area. That traffic to and from that area has to be tightly controlled through the use of a firewall, and it can't bypass any of the firewalls. And if it has to go out to the internet, it has to go through a series of firewalls in order to establish a connection to that one source or that one destination. And those are things like who your processor is, and I have to remember the terms because there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
There's an acquirer, there's like a bank acquirer, there's a processor, there's a merchant, there's the individual cardholder, and then it's based off of, there's a 3-way and a 4-way processing scheme because of, like, as a good example is MasterCard and Visa are classified as a 4-way processor. So they go to, like, a bank, let's say, would subscribe to them to put their logo on the card, right? And then the path of payment would go from the cardholder to a processor to the acquiring bank to Visa and back down, right? Something like that. And then there's a 3-way, which is like Discover and American Express, where those two directly issue the credit for their credit cards directly to their subscriber. So if you have an American Express card, American Express gives you the credit. You don't go through some other source to get it. It was really fascinating on just the simple thing of, securing how the payment card transaction actually happens at a card level from a merchant to a cardholder, what all has to happen. And this is just one piece of just saying, you have firewalls in place. But there's like 11 other requirements that are all broken down into this kind of detail. So it can be kind of overwhelming for some if they, like you said just a minute ago, where do you start with all this?
Yeah,
well, you're going to have to get everybody.
Yeah.
You kind of have to get everybody in a big meeting to say, this is what we want to do. Here's the requirements. Let's go, right? We have to look at it all.
And I have to admit that having gone through this a number of times with a number of different, especially cities, because they're complex, because they're, I almost want to say that doing an assessment is really easy because I can just, right now, just say fail, be done with it. But I got to tell them where they're failing, right? but it's usually, controls are non-existent or whatever, so it makes it a little bit easier doing an assessment because they're not going to pass. But that doesn't help them. So I try to do less assessments and try to do more like, how about I hold your hand and walk you through the process, and then I teach you how to fish, and then you, from there, go forward. That's the process I like to use when engaging with clients, because I want them to be self-sufficient. I don't want them having to call me every time. There's plenty of people out there that need the compliance, so it's not like I'm hurting for work for that, but it's just a matter of making sure that they're all trying to make the world cyber safe, right? That's what we're all trying to do. We work together, we can do that. Thank you for joining us today. So we hit it right at 60 minutes. That's really good. Just remember that we're partners with Stop, Think, Connect. We want you to help us make the world cyber safe, so get the information out there as much as you can. And if you liked our presentation, please give us a shout out or follow our channels. Rob and I both blog on learnsecurity.org if you want to check out some of our stuff. We don't put out a lot, but we try to put out more detailed information and something that can be very useful for you. So please rate us and join us again in the future. Thank you very much.
Have a good day.